Right. Well, thank you, Rob, for revealing one of the great mysteries of the NewSpace industry. I feel many of us here at the moment have Facebook news feeds that are currently cluttered with different stories from the NewSpace industry. Over the years, the description of the industry has been summed up by single descriptive words. So let me give you an example. About 10 years ago, you would read an article about the private space industry, which was part of a new industry. New was the descriptive word. Around 5-ish years ago, there was an invisible transition to describing the industry as developing. What is it being called now? I think it's called burgeoning. If you go read an article, burgeoning is the word. Here to lead us in discussion about non-NewSpace industries that have already burgeoned and are now established is Kelly Girardi. I first met Kelly when she was working for Maston Space Systems, where she was the lead of business development. She's worked as a strategist across a broad spectrum of aerospace companies, government agencies, and nonprofits. She's a media specialist of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, the U.S. trade association of leading commercial spaceflight companies. She is one cool person, and there is very little other people who I'd like to lead this panel discussion. So thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. I'd love to welcome my panelists up now. And we only have an hour for this panel, and there's so many different directions we could go with it. So I'm going to, and I hope that you guys will understand, but I'm going to do very brief introductions for you so that we can use most of the time contextualizing your experience and kind of passing on that insight to the rest of the industry. So very briefly, I will start with Stockton Rush. He's the CEO and co-founder of OceanGate, developing the next gen of manned submersible solutions for subsea operations in research, commercial, and defense sectors. He has piloted me on one of those expeditions, so I can say he is a top-notch sub-pilot, and Erica as well, and I think Esther as well. So yeah, highly rated. We also have Rafferty Jackson, who's a veteran brand and business builder. He's led startups and Fortune 500 companies alike through hyper-growth, IPOs, expansions. She's worked with everything from Beats by Dr. Dre to Vans and the North Face, serving in a variety of roles from legal counsel to vice president to business development to HR. Then we have Don Brancato, the chief enterprise architect of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. His job entails working with the enterprise leaders to discuss, validate, and ensure strategic and tactical initiatives and pain points, and to find a viable, competitive, best practice architecture for a solution. And then we have Matthew Reyes, who's the strategic content manager for GoPro's advanced media team, from VR to 360-degree capture. And then we have Esther Dyson, of course, the chairman of ED Venture Holdings, investing in nurturing startups with recent focus in healthcare, human capital, and aerospace sectors. So we have a lot of people from a variety of different industries, but the one cool thing is that on this stage, everyone has a little bit of space in their blood. Esther spent a year in Star City training as a backup. Half a year in Star City training as a backup cosmonaut. Matt, prior to GoPro, was the head of technical operations for Zero G Corporation. Many of you probably flew in Zero G with him and was a NASA subcontractor. Stockton, commercial pilot, aerospace engineer. Don, before working at Hewlett-Packard, was a former aerospace engineer, and Rafferty has got space in her future. So,
actually, my dad was an engineer on the unmanned rockets out of Cape Canaveral.
I knew it. So in addition to coming from like a variety of different industries, we also have people who are kindred spirits up here on the stage, and so I think that makes their insights particularly valuable. So one of the things that I took away and where I'd love to start this morning is kind of building off of something that Chuck Beams said earlier when discussing Vulcan, saying that as an industry, you know, we've reached a great point of growth, but we're very likely to start seeing a little bit more scrutiny from investors with regard to business plans. You know, they want to see return on investment. They want to see a sound business plan. And one of the ways that we, you know, look in the new space industry towards investment is kind of relying on a board, relying on advisors. And so I wanted to know from your experience in the industries that you work with, To what extent do you rely on the board and advisors, and what roles do they play in strategic investment, and how can we, as an industry, kind of learn from your insights? And Stockton, maybe we'll start with you, because I know you have a lot of experience with
Thank you. I hope it works. Yeah. Well, the board, in one level, is, and our board in particular, we rely on, one of the board members is a retired admiral from the Coast Guard. So we have regulatory issues, and we have a couple of folks represent the investors. When you're in the financing round, obviously there's a mix that you might have of your board and then the operational support, and we've tried to blend those. I think it is critical that you have them from a variety of backgrounds, not just investors, not just enthusiasts. We have a couple of board members who are pretty confrontational, and that actually helps a lot when trying to look at different ideas and making sure you don't just have a lot of yes votes, although I always make sure I have a majority of yes votes. But it is good to have that breadth of board involvement and looking at which constituencies you want to engage, whether you want to impress them with the resumes of your board members because they're an affiliated company, or whether you need an entree. That's something to look at which pieces of the mosaic they fill in your company strategy.
Do you want? So I've sat on many boards. I've negotiated whatever. There's a couple of things to think about, and diversity among board members is really important. They change over time. When a company's starting, board members do everything from help you write press releases to work in marketing, give contacts. They're very involved in the operation of the company. Right to the other end, where they mostly deal with compliance and shareholder relations, and candidly, it's not half as much fun. It's really important for the board not to be just the founder's best friends, because the board needs to represent the shareholders, has fiduciary duty to represent the best interests of the company, not of themselves, not even of the investors, but the company itself. A final thing worth thinking about, I've been on boards of companies that have gotten into trouble. And you can argue all day long about who has how many votes, or, like Mark Zuckerberg, he's got all the votes. But the entity that really has the power in the end is the entity that's going to give the company the next chunk of money if it's in trouble. Because that entity is the one who can decide everything. And sometimes you see things go really badly south, and lots of people get diluted and so forth. But it's really important to understand, once you as an entrepreneur bring in investors, you lose power to those investors if you're not making enough money to sustain yourself without them. And the board likewise has no power if the company's not self-sustaining. I'm sorry to be so gloomy, but it's kind of, you need to think about reality, not just what the law books say.
Yeah, please, Don.
Does this thing work?
I think so.
Oh, wow. Okay, so to concur, partially what you're saying is that as an architect, I get to boil things down and hopefully sell simplicity. But the notion is that boards have a phase, if you will. The first one is one of entrepreneurship, followed by growth, followed by maintenance. They are typically separate boards, and that's why there's a life cycle around them. So their role is one of governance, to assure that an enterprise architecture exists, so that the global events and drivers that the business is taking advantage of with strategy are in fact planned for and expected. So I use the word enterprise architecture as a template for the future. The overarching viewpoint or capability that I expect the board to have is one of governance, to assure that the variance between what's been forecast and what's actually happened it can be minimized and measured such that we can move forward in a measurable way.
Yeah, and I also think, just to add and build off of that oftentimes in young companies that are, positioning themselves for growth, that there's a lot of room for meritocracy to take place. You don't need to necessarily depend on the board of advisors for all of the strategic decision making. Something that I've implemented at a number of organizations that I've worked with is something I stole from a favorite company of mine, Pixar, which is called a brain trust. And basically it's a group of hand-selected people. It can be anyone from a janitor to an intern, anyone who makes you think smarter and can rapidly give you ideas in a short period of time. those are the people you want kind of in your ear and just throwing spaghetti on the wall and going back and forth. And, you know, many, many times in a company even that size, they're responsible for, you know, when suddenly there was once a forest and now there are only trees, someone who can come in and kind of give you the advice that you need and be a fresh set of eyes. So I think that there's a lot of room in this industry to rely on, you know, advisors and, you know, people outside of the board of directors. But moving off of that, I also am interested in the fact that we've grown so much. To a few years ago, we were talking at this stage in Silicon Valley at this conference about the NewSpace echo chamber and the fact that all of us are just consistently telling each other what a great job we're doing. It's so awesome, patting each other on the back, and it's just in this one big echo chamber. And you know, this was the scope. This is where the conversation was ending. We've definitely moved beyond that, largely in part thanks to companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX and Mastodon and all the people who are sending out videos and footage and, you know, propelling us forward. But speaking of branding and consumer engagement, especially with your experience, Rafferty, as well, curious, what can even companies who aren't selling directly to consumer or targeting a tourism bureau, but who are concerned with brand and building that brand for heritage and posterity down the road, what lessons can we learn from other industries?
Yeah, on this point, I have a personal beef with this room. So I live right now down in Santa Monica, which I moved from San Francisco down to Santa Monica to join Beats by Dr. Dre, which is a headphone company. I'm sure you guys hopefully have heard of it. We built a $6 billion market out of nothing, and we sold ourselves to Apple for $3 billion. Did it all in 6 years. We had a lot of reasons why we were able to do that. First of all, we had a visionary at the helm. Jimmy Iovine, he's created more music than, you know, I can even spend time talking to you about. He's basically been touching culture, building culture. And then a guy named Dr. Dre, who, if you don't know The Chronic, you need to listen to The Chronic, even if you don't agree with it, because it changed music. So it's probably similar to you guys stand amongst yourselves and say, oh, did you read that article by so-and-so? It changed space. There's things in culture that have changed culture, and The Chronic is one of those things. Jimmy Iovine doing Patti Smith's Horses, that changed culture. Doing Tom Petty's Refugee album, that changed culture. So I'm working with people who change culture and drive culture. I live where we can see SpaceX launches and contrails and all sorts of exciting things. Nobody knows anything about it. I can look up in the sky and see the contrail going. I can ask my neighbor walking by my stoop, do you know what that is? No, I don't know what that is. There is storytelling to be told. And storytelling is what compels human beings to connect to other human beings. And we all know this. We've seen the cave drawings. We have seen how people tell stories, and we know how we connect with them. We sit with our children every day, read them a bedtime story, right? When you're trying to explain to somebody their job, you're basically telling them a story. One of the challenges I had when Guillermo asked me to come speak here was like, what am I going to talk to you guys about? I feel like you have the most amazing stories. You just saw that rocket landing. It's the first time music played in this room. I had said to somebody at lunch today, this is the most quiet conference I've ever had. There's a reason why Beats by Dr. Dre pulled on the heartstrings of people who had never, ever expected to drop $399 for a pair of headphones, because it connected you to the emotion of your music. It put you in a space that made you, whatever music you were listening to, feel powerful, emotional, connected to humanity, and wanting to go. This last video, when it finally had music, I was like, oh, thank God, somebody is, you know. And if you guys noticed, I wish we could have had a camera on you. When the music played, you all sat up to see what was happening, because that pulls at you. So one thing that I would say is a real challenge for any industry is storytelling. But if you're not storytelling the future of this industry to the young people coming into your business, you're not going to get top talent that can think about problems 360. You've got to have people that obviously can do things that I don't even understand what the people at my lunch table were talking about, and I'm not going to pretend like I understood it. But I do know that if it was me recruiting, I probably could have recruited one of those people to come work for me at for Beats, even though there's no real scientific future for them, because I could have sold them a story. And I could have made them so passionate about whatever we were asking them to do. And I could pull them in, and I could get them into the brand, and we could go. So one thing to really be cognizant of is storytelling is not just to consumers to inspire, but storytelling is within your company to always inspire. And the fact that you guys are doing all this stuff and nobody is talking about it, or if they are, they're not talking to it, the earlier comment this morning about the arts, the fact that you don't necessarily have artists in your business, you need that whole other side of the brain in the business to tell the story, right? You've got to have that passion. That's the only way it keeps going, because the reality is people aren't watching NASA launches like they were when I was growing up. It's just now they're watching YouTube and they're watching other stuff and they're just not as inspired.
It's a good thing for us to keep in mind, especially because in this room, I think it's very easy, to have some sort of confirmation bias that space is the thing outside of these walls, outside of the city, and that we are all living on this precipice of the big, exciting future. But that doesn't come without hard work and a lot of convincing and a lot of compelling narrative. And I know that so many of you have had experiences in brands that are, really working towards building a cohesive brand vision. And are there any other insights or sort of, tips and tricks of the trade?
I just, when you were talking, I thought of this wonderful billboard that British Airways had in the middle of London for a while. And it was electronically rigged. Whenever a BA flight would go across the sky, the eyes of the billboard would follow it. It would say BA 876 to Warsaw or something flying above, something clever like that. That captures the imagination, that probably is incredibly cheap for the amount, not just of people that saw it, but then news coverage and so forth. It's that kind of imagination you need.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to add, from GoPro's perspective, being able to, I would always advocate, if you want to outsource your storytelling, we're here. I'm here to help you do that. But the fact of the matter is that, indeed, to kind of go back to the first question too, I haven't been on a board, but I've advised folks, and I've been like, okay, keep quiet. Tell your story when you have your story, when things are working. And one of the big things at GoPro that we're looking for are the uniqueness of something that people can actually do, can participate in, can be watching and experiencing, can have that rumble. In some cases, it can be make their own video. And so if you're going to engage with people that you want to sell something to or at least inspire, make them feel like they can be that person. That's why we have the point of view shot. That's why it's the selfie stick. If you can immerse people, your future workforce or your customers, to be participants in your experience, then that's the tip that I can help provide.
One thing that in the storytelling line, I wanted to be an astronaut, and it was not just because of NASA, it was the Apollo astronauts, the people part.
Yeah.
It's too easy as an engineer to focus on the technology. The rockets are beautiful, what the technology does is beautiful, but you got to tell the story around the people that are there, and that's one of the nice things about some of the discussions about the interns, but really focusing on a core of individuals, because that makes a story, and technology alone doesn't sell.
So there's a beautiful pattern that I'm hearing here, because as every engineer goes, give me 3 to 5 dots on a page, and I'm going to extrapolate with confidence to figure out where the 6th dot is going to be. So when a story is told 3 times or hits YouTube, now many people get to hear it. As my drill sergeant said 40 years ago, if you say a thing 1,000 times, it will become part of the culture and everyone will say it. If you tell the story, more and more will get said. I look at process. When a process happens more than 3 times, my first question is, why are we not automating that process? Why are we not looking at variants of that process? The story, the process, the pattern. After this happens thousands of times, the story now becomes a local standard, the way our culture does it. When we start to do it that way, we start to aspire for the variances that we see and differences in those patterns under different kinds of environments. So now I'm going to spew a little bit about standards for a second. Because ultimately, if the story gets told over and over again, we want it repeatable, because we know repeatability gives us cheaper costs, commoditization, better quality, and things tend to show up on time better. So the idea is that we create standards that start locally with our community and ultimately rise up into industrial standards. Everyone in this room expects to walk over and put in their plug for their Android or their Apple device, and there's 2 plugs. Well, if you go to the UK tonight, you'll see that that's a different plug. If you go to France the next morning, it's a different plug still. The notion of standards help us to involve our global community to tell that story repeatably so that we can go farther, not just go to Mars, but go beyond. So this is a pattern that we see in enterprise architecture and global standards. And the idea is that when a rocket goes up and is in LEO, the idea is that maybe I can reuse that to plug into another brand of rocket to take it safely back to Earth. That's going to imply global standards. So we see the story, we tell it, and we know in this room that anything we can dream about or imagine, we know the first step is to understand the math and the physics. And after that, it's really going to happen. Because if we can dream it, that's the beauty of being an engineer. If you can dream it, it can actually happen. And then we just need a story around it so we can collect the dollars, so we can build a prototype, so we can go out and make it repeatable, get a standard so lots of people use it and want to reuse it.
And that sort of standard is something that, the new space industry really has an advantage on. I mean, new space is operating at a totally different economy of scale than other more mature industries. If you want to adopt a standard in launch vehicles, you just need to convince 10 launch providers that this is the logical, safest, best, most efficient way to do things, and then that's the industry standard. Whereas in healthcare or anything else, you're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of different entities to convince. So that's something for the entire industry to keep in mind and use in their favor. I also wanted to go back a little bit to the short amount of runway that a lot of new space companies have. Right? You're spending a lot of time on R&D. You're building products. You're moving towards this vision. And how in more industries that have been around for a little bit longer, how have you seen the balance of this tension between wanting to build the best engineering solution and attack the problem, that innate engineering desire, versus the need to very more strategically even kind of position yourself for success long term as a company?
Wow, okay. So if you watch technology companies grow, when they get to the point of maintenance where they own a vertical, let's pick on my company, Hewlett-Packard. As you grow these big companies, what happens is that the demand that you now can buy R&D. You now can buy products. You now can do mergers and acquisitions. You can buy the capability that you're missing. It's contextual to your brand. It's not part of what you do. So you buy it from someone else and incorporate it into new space. So the idea is standards really matter then, because if you're going to be acquired by some larger technology or company, the closer you are to some standards, the easier you can integrate into their story. So we use expressions like seamless or boundaryless information flow, because the cost of buying product, the biggest cost is born in integration. So I see the way it goes is that you don't think of my company as being involved in space, but yet we are. So if you go to a Boeing or to a SpaceX, you'll see our capabilities aligned through many of those. It's just not necessarily part of our branding. So ultimately, what I see happening is that all of us want to be acquired so that we can pay back our stockholders and present value to the employees and shareholders. In order to do that, the idea is we have to be successful, we have to align with some kind of standard, and now we have to be attractive, and we have to minimize the cost of integration from the buying, purchasing, holding, or integrating company.
Esther?
So I'll kind of take a shorter term, earlier stage point of view on this. And the thing to how many of you want to be an entrepreneur? You already are. Okay. How many of you want to do something in particular and you think being an entrepreneur is the best way to do it? Okay, that makes me happy, because being an entrepreneur is, it's not, you should want to do something and then you should figure out what's the best way to do it. Well, maybe I'll be an entrepreneur for a while, then I will hire a good CEO so that I can keep doing the fun stuff, which is the science or the engineering or the marketing or the product design, and have somebody else deal with the lawyers and the investors and all the boring things that are involved with running a company. Some people are really good at that, but often the people who start companies aren't. So the first thing as an entrepreneur is to understand that your goal is not to remain CEO forever, but to create a company that is self-sustaining, not just to create a product. but to create a company that can create more products after the first product succeeds, wears out, you pivot away. The essence of companies is change. And so if you have a vision that's too fixed rather than a direction you want to go, you often end up in trouble. So the biggest thing companies need to deal with is the change, the going through stages, understanding the difference between an R&D company from a production company, from a company whose job is really the production of new units, or maybe it's a company that's been so successful it's now being attacked on all sides by competition and it needs to figure out a new way to go. But it's all about change and adjustment and understanding, are you the right person for this stage, or is there some other part of your team that could do it better than you? And the very best CEOs don't do anything at all. They hire the right people, and then they can, ultimately they probably go start something else, but your goal is not to hang on to that title. Your goal is to create something and then let it free.
Since Esther did the show of hands, I'll follow up. How many in the audience are engineers or trained as engineers? As I suspected, one of the things that I talked to Kelly about, what we did is looking at commercial off-the-shelf technology. In some of your applications, it'll be open source software, but there's this desire by engineers to make stuff. That's what's taught in school. You don't go take something off the shelf when you're asked for an answer to a problem set. And we find, in particular, it's this getting to this culture issue of, is it strategically important that we develop this product, this component, this material handling system or software? Or is this just something the engineers really want to do because they've seen something that's commercially available, they know they can make it for less cost, but they're not taking into consideration life cycle costs, all the documentation and everything else that goes with it. But there's always that push to look at stuff that is new. And I'll give you an example. We developing our new submarine. The last control system we made, we got an industrial joystick because that's what we wanted. It had to be waterproof, $600, plus another $10,000 of integration and software. On the new sub, we use a Sony PlayStation controller. And it's $29 if you buy it retail and brand correct, and it's designed for a 16-year-old to throw against the wall and continue to work. And we put 3 of them in the sub in case one of them breaks. And that required that I force it down the engineers' throats that this is how we're going to do it. The downside of that is they all wanted the PlayStation 4 when that came out. But I think it's very important from the CEO level to look at all these applications and constantly ask, is this strategically important? Is this what we have to do? Because there's always a way to do it, cheaper, better, faster, but let somebody else do it unless it's going to be a competitive advantage to your company.
That's a remarkable story. If in innovation cultures outside of where you guys are, right? So in the cultures that I've been in at Beats and at the North Face and Vans and Reef, Eagle Creek, Jansport and Lucy, one of the challenges we had was the way that apparel and footwear has been built historically in the United States was that the brands went to the mill and said, so show me your new fabrics. And then I'd look at his new fabrics and then I'd think to myself, what can I do with this? Does this fit my Reef consumer? Does this fit my North Face consumer? Well, we started seeing 10 years ago that a bunch of Apple patents on apparel were starting to come out, and a bunch of Google patents on apparel were starting to come out. And as you can imagine, in a 100-year-old company that's been built by turning to the mill and tell me what's innovative, and I'll see if I can apply it, that's the end of that industry, with the new market coming in, right, with Apple and Google looking at apparel. So they had to launch an entire innovation platform and try to change the hearts and minds of 80,000 people that had been working one particular way for 100 years. And the very first thing we were required to do as the top 150 leaders were go outside. We were required to spend 1 year outside of apparel, footwear, and equipment, taking every meeting with every kind of business we could possibly take. I was at Philips in Eindhoven learning about blue light technology. I was in BMW's factories learning about how they curve that leather perfectly into the wood in the most expensive of the BMW cars. So what's great about your story is that is ingenuity by analogy. That is just standing back and saying to yourself, I need a device to do a thing that does these things. Oh, look, there's one at the store called Sony PlayStation. So in your industries, I expect that people like me came to you to be the outside, to check the box. I came and went to, pretend like I went to SpaceX. But I would really encourage you guys to also go the other way. Make sure you're going into regular everyday industries and saying, how are they solving their problems? How are they thinking about their problems? Because the idea of what you did is just, that is, you would actually have, been given a stock option award from VF as part of the innovation platform for having come up with that, because that's what they were trying to mind shift people from, was to go outside, learn about something, bring it in, and apply it to your circumstances, as opposed to the way we used to do it, which was we did nothing. We just stood there and waited for the mill to tell us what was happening, and we tried to figure out how to do something with it. Completely shifted VF. If you guys go look at their stock, you can actually see from 2007 to where they are now, you'll see this all of a sudden, this bump. And that bump is because you're 3 years into the innovation platform. You're 3 years into everybody thinking in a totally different way. So that's a great story. Anytime you can use analogies like that for an innovation culture, by going outside, and it sounds like for the echo chamber, like you guys need to go outside. The only other thing I'd say before I turn over the mic again is if you don't have what are called reverse engineers from the IDEO design thinking methodology, I encourage all of you to go get one right now. And there are kids in this room that I saw that would be perfect for this. The idea is you go down age, as deep as you can go, to somebody that's way outside your wheelhouse. So my reverse engineers are kids who are, I try to get 15 and 16-year-olds who are just prolific on their phones. They are on their phones. They are moving through the world in a way that I don't. They're Snapchatting and they're videoing. And all I do is ask them every 2 weeks, can I just sit behind you for an hour and watch what you're doing? And all I'm trying to do is watch how they're interacting with the world, right? I'm not trying to perv on them. I'm not trying to do anything creepy. I'm actually genuinely just trying to see how they're moving through the world, because it's so radically different than how I'm moving through the world, and I'm going to lose touch. So I'm trying to learn how they're moving through the world, and then I always ask them a question. So the last question I asked my reverse mentor is, how did they feel about Apple downloading the YouTube album on your phone without your consent? The word from a 15-year-old was, it was theft. They stole my memory, and that is theft. That is not what Apple intended. But if you had asked a 15-year-old, how would you feel about somebody downloading something on your phone without your consent, you would have heard the word theft. So anytime you could also go down age, as far and as deep, I always say, go into your civic community, your neighbors, whatever, somebody you're not related to, because you have to ask them genuine questions. That's another way to help with the storytelling and the youthfulness and bringing in the connection to the world and making sure that you are relevant in the world. Because what you're doing, yes, could mean something scientifically, but what you're trying to do is move the world forward. You have to be connected to the world to be able to make that connection happen.
So what you just described so excites me, because there's a lot of engineers in this room, and how many people went to engineering school and learned about reuse coefficients and get excited about it? No one. We want to invent things ourselves. So as an old guy who somehow managed to survive for a few years, I think it's a thing we need to start doing. I live here in Seattle, not both, and someone said that I need to act more like a 7th grader. 7th graders know how to reuse other people's stuff. They share their lunches. They get along together. They go from one school to the next, and they have people step into their volleyball games and soccer games. I get to see this all the time now. It's apparently not legal to do that. So they break the rules. They bend the rules a little bit. We need to do that in this industry, in our industry, in order to go faster. Borrow other people's stuff. Incorporate it into your solution, and don't feel guilty about it. That's a hard thing to come off with, but I think we have to do it. I love the joystick story. Go ahead.
Yeah, to just add a little bit to this, where I do see a fun parallel with what we're working on is a GoPro is entering the virtual reality and augmented reality space, and you see that had been dominated over the years. A lot of attention in academia 16, 20 years ago, even older, but of recent years, like 3D printing, the hacker community. I get people who are building their own cameras because they can afford to cobble them together. In fact, a number of years ago, I tried making my own even before I even dreamed of coming to GoPro. What I do because I obviously work in this space, I'm paying attention and listening to the content generators. There are some very professional houses, very expensive houses out there that we want to learn from. We want to sell them our cameras, of course, but we also want to learn what their technique is, because the power of storytelling when you have a window, your screen, is very different when you're talking about looking over here and what's over there, and how does it sound, and how do you what's the choreography behind the story. And so in terms of setting standards, it's a free-for-all right now. And so what we're trying to do is engage with all the different communities out there. There are some very big, powerful names on a Facebook group that we pay attention to. But going to trade shows and just putting content out there and then absorbing what other people are making. Listening and actually, hopefully, like I said, selling them a camera eventually. Working with them on software so that they can get the storytelling right. Because as of right now, very few people are doing it right, because people get sick or because the story is not interesting. The parallel I see to NewSpace is that it's a free-for-all. There's a lot of people out there that are doing different things that are very related, and I think that sometimes, I think this conference has done a good job of that, but sometimes I get the sense over the years that a lot of people, even though there is an echo chamber, they're not listening. They're not paying attention to what somebody else is doing, and in fact, they're reinventing wheels. And so that's the thing that I want to avoid. We must avoid at GoPro. We don't want to waste our money reinventing wheels. We want to innovate, push the ball forward, and by doing that, we're bringing together and listening to communities. And that's the same.
And building on something that you guys are all touching on is this sort of fundamental shift in a mindset. And I want to try to tie that back to culture at a company, at an industry. My personal belief is that culture trumps strategy every single time. You can have as many PowerPoint seminars, this is how we're going to do it from now on, but unless the truth on the ground, culture adopts those norms and values, then you're going to make zero headway there. So what success have you found in your industries in helping to shape an innovative, open-minded, and candid culture of feedback and of progress and growth?
I wish I could say it was easy, but the founder needs to have the courage and the conviction to hire people who have the right culture. And that also means firing the people who don't, in a nice way. But the reality is behavior speaks louder than words and mission statements and stuff like that. It's worth saying there's a subset of CEO founders who are delusional, and really,
It's true.
When you put someone in charge, people start lying to them. It's really important, if you're running a company or you're running something, to be the person who doesn't encourage lying. You need to welcome bad news. It's really uncomfortable. I have a company of 5 people, and I had another one of 5 people long ago. I had a CEO, and long story, but she came to me one day after I'd been sort of grumpy and said, I'm really scared to tell you this, but we are not trying to make you unhappy. We're trying to get your computer fixed. We're doing the best we can. And this was a company of 5 people. And she was terrified to tell me the truth, that I was being a jerk. Imagine what it's like when you're in a company of 100 people, or you're a billionaire who's paying the salaries of everybody around you, or you run a division. You need to be the person who welcomes the truth and who listens rather than shuts down problems. This is why, if you read the Challenger and the Columbia reports, people didn't want to hear that there were still safety problems. That was what happened. It wasn't that the technology didn't work. The technology never works. You need to fix it. People in charge who don't take the trouble to listen to the problems and get them fixed, those are the ones who create disasters, whether they're disasters in space or disasters in corporations.
And for people who are not executives and who are working at companies, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I feel like a really good litmus test is if there's more candor in the hallways of where you work than in the rooms and the meetings where key policy and decisions are being made, then you have a culture problem. And that needs to come from the ground up and be addressed, because that's a head-on collision.
And you should
That's a really good point.
Sorry, and you should never think you can't quit. There's always another option.
I would encourage what we called a beats at break question, and every department had their own break question, and that was the question that even if the candidate was lights out, if they answered that one wrong, it was done. And we did not hire them. And everybody had it. So one of the break questions that we ended up with at Beats, because we misunderstood what was happening and then we started to figure it out, we thought you had to be passionate about music. You guys can understand that, right? It's a headphone, it's a speaker company, you're working for music people, we're listening to music. Then we had all these really resume successful people that didn't work. So we took time to go back and look at what wasn't working. And what we figured out was you had to be passionate about something. It didn't have to be music. Those people were actually not passionate about something outside of work. They were really passionate about the work, but they didn't have something that was making them crazy on the weekends to solve or at night to solve. And so we started to figure out that some of our best people were people that were crazy about hula dancing. And we had a guy who was a competitive arm wrestler. He actually had a plate in his arm because he had an illegal meet and broke his arm, right? So we started to figure out it wasn't music. You didn't actually have to be passionate about music. You had to be bananas for making cupcakes, or you had to be just crazy for Renaissance string music and learning how to play some instrument. So we had a company break question, which was, what are you passionate about? And the person, if they said, oh, I'm super passionate about enterprise architecture, and that's what I really want to do, that was a break. That was part of the questioning that we maybe wouldn't hire the person. And then my personal departments, and at that point I had strategy, BD, HR, legal, and facilities. And our break question was, what's your DJ name? And if the person couldn't just make one up, that was it. Didn't have to be a good name. Didn't have to be a quality name. They just had to say, what's my DJ name? Yeah, if you were a DJ, what would be your name? Oh, I don't know, DJ Fancy Pants. Okay, great. You answered it. But if you were the kind of person who was like, oh, well, I don't DJ. I'm not sure I understand what DJing is. Do you mean do I DJ? If they were stumbling through that, what we figured out was for those because my groups were service groups. We served the other parts of the business to thrive, right? So if they couldn't be flexible and have a sense of humor and go with what was being asked, they weren't going to be successful. So I would suggest when you guys are thinking about how you build your culture that you guys hunker down on great questions. If these people do not pass those great questions, don't hire them, because they might be the right people technically, but they're not going to drive it. And it costs you so much money, and then you're rehiring, and then you're terminating. People are upset, and just try not to bring them in, and just try to get the right people to come in.
I think one thing, back to what Esther was saying about boards, how they evolve over time. Company cultures evolve. Your company values shouldn't. That should stay solid. You're going to be, as a startup, it's all about innovation. Then you get to productizing, and the culture's got to match where you are in the stage. Elements of the company have to be something people can hang on to, the value statements of what you're for. But when you go from innovation to first product launch to acquisition, culture will switch, and some people will make the switch and some won't. And that's a real challenge as a CEO. How do you manage that? How do you know where you are? Is the culture appropriate for where you are at the time, appropriate for the market you're going to attract and where your product is? And how do you blend it, enforce it? It's a very difficult and complicated process.
This notion of building culture is fascinating. Here we are in probably the second or third chapter of the information age, the age of the algorithm, if you will. When you saw that rocket take off, it's fascinating how you minimize the movement of the metacenter in order to maintain stability of the rocket. And the idea is that that's a software algorithm that's doing that. That's about automation and ultimately about autonomics. There's a fear in our global culture about what happens to jobs. And my work, one of the things that I get to do is to look at processes across the enterprise and figure out how to automate those things. There's fear amongst workers that they're being excluded from the paradigm because they'll lose their job because automation takes over. Robots take over. That's never happened before. We don't know what that's like. In order to be inclusive, it requires a couple of vectors I'll claim in a notion of our culture. We need to have cultures that are cohesive and binding, that makes us want to keep coming back. because as job changes, we have to look at other places. You'll hear things like netocracy, who you know, what you know in terms of algorithms, languages, libraries, mechanics, how those patterns continue to deploy. And often people will move laterally. In the past, I mean, in my life, my parents and grandparents had jobs that they stayed after 30 and 40 years. Typically, someone like an engineer, lasts 3 to 5 years, and we're off to the next thing because often we're bored. And we want to move off to the next interesting pattern, so we get to solve new problems and equations. So it means that our leadership has to constantly respond to us, the culture. We're the thing that drives the algorithm, if you will, the organization. So I'll claim that this culture that we're driving to, there's a couple things that we need to think about. One is how can we make people comfortable that they're part of a ongoing story. They're not going to be left behind. How can we continually automate so that we can go faster to get where we want to go? How can we have that automation move into autonomics, where now the equations are self-fulfilling and self-healing? And those are scary things to us as a culture. So I would encourage all of us to think about how we're going to do that, how we're going to continue to evolve inclusiveness so as not to lose our workers, our audiences.
Yeah, GoPro and culture. So, GoPro is big on sports, action, adventure. Nick Woodman, our CEO, brilliant move, 3 hours or 2 hours, I think it's 3, off on Thursdays to go take your cameras out and do things. But the whole point is that you're becoming, as an employee, becoming more familiar with your product, or with our product, with the camera. But you're also getting really excited. It's called Live It, Love It, Eat It, because you can have lunch, you can make lunch, you can actually bake and cook as well. And so, but the really interesting thing I like about the culture with GoPro and how they foster innovation is because there are people who are in completely different parts of the company, but again, I think you were saying, it's like the bikers, they all get together. Not snowboarding so much, it's a little far from where we are, but surfing for sure. It's a surfer-founded company. So, but what's really fun, and I think applicable here, is that when you're bringing people together and they're having fun, they're talking about, sometimes they're venting, and that happens. It's a growing company, over 1,000 people now. But a lot of times they're trying to hash out the problems in their head, and they have that stress relief, and that's when the creativity, the creative juices flow. And having somebody who is an engineer working with somebody who's a creative, and by creative I mean like a film editor, that's a crazy combination. It's really hard to actually deal with in the work environment. But coming together outside the work environment, amazing things happen. So, my recommendation is that let your employees play with your product, give them all rocket rides, and right, and you'll have the best workplace you ever known.
I couldn't agree more. I have one last topic that I just thought of, and then we'll open it up to questions. But when we were talking about hiring for culture fit, it just kind of sparked just a flag in the back of my head, because I agree, and when I look and do the hiring process, I'm always hiring for culture fit. It's totally out there, but again, I go back to this confirmation bias. Like, what if your company is all young white men, and then you have a diversity candidate who's here, and you're trying to hire for culture fit? Then it becomes a really significant necessity that the person, and even down to the young employee who might be doing interviews themselves, is really trained well on what culture fit means, and has a little bit of guidance in that direction, because I really worry about that and I think that's the last point I want to ask all of you is, what can our industry learn from other more established industries about diversity? At the beginning of 2016, I vowed never again to moderate an all-male panel. It was just too much. And it sounds like such a stupid thing, but you can't imagine how many all-male panels I've sat up here and moderated their discussion of. And I'm happy we've achieved parity on stage. Yeah. So that's great. And in the crowd, too. And so we're getting there. But what more can we do? Because when we talk about topics of such societal significance, of what does the future of the species entail, or robots taking over the world, like, that cannot be an all-white male conversation. So, like, how? Before we open it up to questions, and I want to know from each of you, like, I know Rafferty in particular, you work with female entrepreneurs, but from all of you, what can we learn and what can we implement to help create this future that's to all of our benefit.
Well, like all these things, yeah, it starts at the top. We're in the submersible business. There are essentially no women in the submersible business. All the women who drive submersibles, we've trained. And that was because we decided, and I got into this in order to change humanity's view of the ocean. And so a little goal. And part of that was, how do you inspire kids? And you're not going to inspire them by a 50-year-old guy coming and talking to you about subs. And you're going to lose half your audience if you don't have women. And you're going to lose more if it's hard enough to find women candidates, but also finding minority candidates. And we have a foundation that goes out to schools and tries to inspire kids. And the goal was have most of our pilots be between the ages of 22 and 30, and have a majority, or as many as we could, of female pilots, because that's important to inspire. And if you want to get the best talent pool in your company, you've got to show a diverse workplace. And it is often difficult because you start off as a startup with, 3 or 5 people who are similar types, because that's why you got together to start the business. And it really takes a concerted effort. It is not easy. And we have to, with the women we find, we train them from ground zero. And then we got to match them with an old guy, because some of the passengers want to have old people around.
So first, a brief anecdote, and then some kind of solution. 2 years ago, I was asked to go to the Milken Conference and join a panel called Women in Space. And I wrote back very politely and said, do you mind telling me if you have panels called Men in Banking? To their credit, they wrote back and said, no, actually, we don't. We'll just call it Space. And it was for women, and it was great. The reality is, so many companies complain they can't find engineers, they can't find minority candidates, they can't find women, and it's because they want somebody that's fully formed already. They want a black woman who's engineer trained and has worked at IBM for 4 years. Companies need to understand that part of their job is to bring people in who have talent and train them. It's not simply to look for ones that are ready-made. You probably can't do that when you're 5 people, but by the time you get to 50 or 100, that is your job. It's to build people, not just build products, but to build your organization, you need to start with fresh people and bring them in.
I think the hiring for potential, right, is what you hear as the most critical solution for bringing diversity. Think of it very practically. If you have one point of view on your problem, be it all white women, all white men, all women of color, all Asian men, whatever it is, you have one point of view on your problem, you have a really poor set of eyes on your problem. If you have around the table people that are from all sorts of socioeconomic backgrounds, different kinds of education, different countries, speaking different languages, you have the better, higher quality group thinking. We all know it. It's not, that's not radical, that's proven, all that good stuff. I think the hardest thing is the hiring for potential. But it's also a challenge when you're talking about you've got to have a double E degree. Well, you're starting to widow the world down, right? So if you really want to bring diversity into your marketplace or into your company, I mean, you've got to start thinking about it really much broader than how you've been thinking about it. Like, I was really careful about it, facilities. Lots of people don't necessarily think of facilities as a great job. Facilities can be an amazing job. You can impact a whole company. Where do they sit? What are the colors? Are people inspired? Do they like their workplace? I, in particular, was driving really hard to get vets into my business. It was very hard to get vets to apply into the Beats business until we really started recruiting them into facilities because, man, these men and women, they got space, they got hustle. They were exactly what we needed to have for the foundation of Beats. And at the time, it was a little bit of a fight. Because people are like, well, that guy might have PTSD, it's a little scary, I don't understand what it means. I was like, oh my God, you sound like somebody talking about the first black person working into the workplace. See, I mean, I was really graphic about my language and being controversial, but you do have to think about these things. And it's unfortunate, but you have to architect it. It's not going to happen naturally. You cannot expect that he and I are going to sit with each other and naturally be able to draw in a woman of color to come work for us. We're going to naturally draw in people who look like us and probably went to our universities and speak probably like we speak and speak English as a first language. We have to say to each other, what are we going to do to get more women into these roles, or more people of color into these roles, or more disabled people into our company? What are we going to do? And we have to architect it. And then, like you said, build standards on it. Because once it happens, you can get it to happen. And I think you're exactly right. The challenge is the younger the person is, it's harder than it is probably the older, because we've all come up through a different generation. Like, my mom wanted a math degree, but her university wouldn't give women math degrees. So she has a French degree, and that's a total waste of talent, right? But I come from that generation. We come from that generation. The younger generation, they might need actually a conversation about, don't necessarily hire the guy that looks like your fraternity brother. Like, let's make sure we're thinking about everybody. Did we recruit from everywhere? And you have to architect it. It's just the way it is.
So this is a beautiful story to hear. I suppose I've just finished raising, well, I don't think you're ever finished raising having kids, but I finished raising sort of 7 kids. They're out in the world now, and they're out looking for jobs and so on. And one of the things that I've said that I want to work and live and be part of a community that looks like the world. And the world is not a bunch of guys like me. It's a very different space, and I'm most comfortable and I'm most creative, and I work the hardest when I work in a community that looks like the world. And now I've raised these kids that almost in some respects many of my peers think are monsters. My daughter walked out of an interview for a job recently. She's an engineer, because she checked out the bathrooms and she said, anyone that treats women with bathrooms like these, I can't work there. We need to treat everyone like they're our best friends, like they're our neighbor, like they're our children and our families, because all of you are. And the best place to make that demand is from the practitioners. There's more of us in this room than there are the leaders of our companies. And we expect top-down, bottom-up leadership. We want our leaders to fend for us in the market space. We want our local managers and so on to make sure that we've provided a place that looks like a planet. And when we're that way, this is a global community. Space will not be effective until it looks like not patches that say company, country flags, but it says Earth on it. I'm one of the guys that grew up with Star Trek, and I still dream about the Space Federation and this notion of being able to go to worlds where no one has, we cut out the word man, where no one has gone before. And that's the beauty of this conference. One of the best things about it, exciting me, is that there's young people coming into this trade that now have the opportunity to be global and be part of this continuum that takes us from Earth to some other place.
Yeah, this is, GoPro, master of brand, master of communication, how we project and portray things. This could certainly be a whole panel on its own. And even at NASA, we were really trying to focus on addressing how to inspire. I think from a chewable nugget of things that you can do. GoPro, we put out videos, we select videos, we look at messages, and we make sure that they're always positive messaging. When a lot of people are seeing the same thing over and again, if they're seeing themselves, they're seeing cultural relevance, on the screen, then they can feel emotionally empowered to do things. And whether that's on a gender basis or on a racial basis or whatnot, that's something that is our responsibility to identify and to push forward. The other aspect too, and Esther really nailed it here, is that we do have responsibility to understand our role in nurturing individuals. And all too often we do, GoPro's smack in the middle of the Silicon Valley. This is not unique to GoPro or Silicon Valley, but there are definitely subcultures in tech industry that can be broken if our leaders of these companies stopped and took a minute to realize what is the little bit extra energy that needs to be added to an employee to bring them up. Unfortunately, in the Valley and elsewhere, we see there is some level of disposability with employees. It's a larger conversation, and we lose sight of the fact that we need to nurture individuals as well. So hopefully, if for your companies, and if you have a way to identify how to nurture, how to move the ball forward, and how to celebrate them, how to project them so that everybody can feel emotionally inspired from a young age on, that's the most important thing, I think.
Amen. I'm going to suggest that as a panel topic for next year. Super important. But I know we started a little bit late, so I'm going to ask for just 5 minutes of questions. I'm going to challenge you guys and you to keep the questions and responses to 20-second responses. Let's rapid fire go through these.
I totally agree that there's a NewSpace echo chamber, and when you brought that up, I was kind of surprised by the direction that the discussion took. I mean, the thing seems to be that you're not telling the story properly, and I can tell you that there's plenty of people in this industry who can tell stories and make promises and say, hey, we're going to go to space. And there's been a real shortage in some areas of the ability to actually do that. You look at X-Core, which has just suspended the links. You look at Branson's been telling the same story for 12 years.
20-second challenge, Doug.
Okay, so yeah, sorry, I'm kind of cutting into your talking, I guess.
No.
I mean, the point is that the question is, when is the industry going to actually look at it itself more critically? And the last thing that you had, the last conference you had, came after this Virgin Galactic crash, and there was almost no mention of it. And, you know, echo chambers don't work.
No one else wants
I know
to
that's a hard question.
Does anyone else want to speak to that? Or
I think we should, here's a suggestion. Let's just ask all the questions really, really quickly, and then each of us can answer one question quickly.
Okay, echo chamber, we'll come back to that.
My question is actually pretty open and anyone can answer. As you're building cultures and companies, do you see being a founder who's going to be irrelevant as you're building the vision itself? And what is the role of humans in the future of system building anyway? So when you talk about culture, do you really even want humans anymore in that equation? So it's a pretty broad question.
Very good question. All right, let's take 2 more questions and then maybe 3, so each of you can answer one.
Okay, so mine's not actually a question, but it's a thank you for bringing up the storytelling. Jeff Nunn with the Museum of Flight. We are here to tell your story. So come talk to me if you want help telling your story.
Good, look at that. Perfect.
For Rafferty, and actually sort of on that point, do you think that NewSpace in particular, has an especially great challenge with regards to building a narrative that the public can buy into, that consumers can buy into, given that the narrative that has prevailed for so long is that space is, it's just not accessible to most people. It's for the elite. It's for the best and the brightest. Do you think that there's a particular challenge that makes it harder for space industry to sell itself, to embed itself in the public consciousness?
Well, 2 more questions really quick, and then we'll...
All right, hey, mine's quick. Recent graduate of UW here, and I'm just curious about what your DJ name is.
Good one. Very good one.
Erin Adamic with Data Security. I have a question regarding cultural shifts. Specifically, how do we create a cultural shift to make people think more about cybersecurity and things like secure by design and include that in the dialogue?
Okay, awesome. So let's take these. And to be honest, I'm most curious about hearing Stockton's DJ name.
Maybe all of ours.
Yeah, all of you need to have DJ name by the end of this. But also, just to recap quickly, the topics that we're going to rapid fire go through. We had Rafferty's question, but before that, we had the larger, broader question. We talked about the echo chamber, and maybe it's in fact that we are telling the story, but there are other things holding us back. We also have what is the role of humans in the future? Maybe that's something, Dawn, that you can address in systems. Do we even want them there? We've got the DJ names, and we had a good plug for the Museum of Flight. All right, cool. Good. So let's start with that.
I want to do humans. So we have different challenges subsea. Weight is not our enemy. It's all about buoyancy, so we can tolerate some weight. And in the subsea space, most of the people look at robots and autonomous vehicles. The thought is it's like the Matrix. We're going to have super smart things, do super smart stuff in environments we haven't discovered and we don't understand. People are the world's greatest supercomputer with the 2 greatest manipulators, and you run on 140 watts, and you don't have to feed them all the time. So it is very difficult to replace the human brain and the human experience when you're exploring. When you get a repeatable task, yes, but I think that the role of, it's not that machines are going to replace people, it's how they're going to augment us, how they're going to enhance what we're doing. And when you look at space exploration or ocean exploration or anything where you're going into the unknown, I think it's a good bit of time before computers are going to be able to handle that uncertainty.
And DJ name?
Well, I have to say, I was asked this question by an old partner, Graham Hawks, when I was in his sub. He said I had to have a handle, and the only thing I thought of was as a kid, my siblings used to call me Captain Crash.
I'm glad you told me that after you took me on your
So my DJ name was DJ Riff Raff. The best DJ name I had was an SEC, and a person very high up at the SEC was interviewing Beats for a position, and when I asked him the question, thinking for sure he'd just beef on it, he said, DJ, shut your mouth. I was like, that's a good one. So to answer your question about the storytelling, come on, guys. You have fire, you have rockets, you have stuff that, you know, the guys at Vans would literally have killed for to tell a story about, right? They're having to storytell. And you know this from GoPro, right? Like, come on, these are the best stories to tell. I think that what maybe you're confused about is you're just thinking of yourselves as an engineering company, and you're not. You have human resources people, you have facilities people, you have people answering your phones, you have people delivering your mail, you have people making your marketing, you have a ton of people in your organizations doing all sorts of important creative stuff. Those are the people that I would say think about inspiring, right? Besides your engineering core, think about all the other people you're bringing into your business, all your vendors, all your partners, all that storytelling. You guys have amazing storytelling, and I'll be really fast. That Blue Origin video, if you want to get kids from the inner city to come, just take the video, drop a different song on it, and you would have that whole room going like, oh, right? Because now you're pulling into their culture, plus you're telling a story visually. And that's all it's going to take to create that kind of diversity. You go to the inner city neighborhoods and the big metropolitan areas of America, and you tell that same exact video, but you put like a Kendrick Lamar beat to it, you're done. Those kids are going to be like, you're telling me if I do math, that's where I get to go? Oh, that's where I'm going to start doing my math, and I'm going to start going there.
Music.
Boy, the human piece. So humans are great at ideation, coming up with new ideas, originating things that a particular system that's purpose-built just is not going to get. So we've got 100 to 200 years easily of complex, original things that we'll think of, and that will just keep on growing. I'm quite confident. So I'll say that no one in this room has to worry about loss of being able to play in the story. That's an interesting one for me because I get asked, and I even get audiences that get upset because they feel like they're going to be railroaded out of their career, and maybe their children or grandchildren will as well. But there's a lot of thinking that's going on in that space, but I can assure you that humans will always be a critical piece of this. And the piece that I will ask you back is that consider that the nature of work is likely to change. That maybe you have more free time, and that free time, rather than working 12 to 15 hours a day, maybe you're writing poetry or creating beats for Dr. B, Dr. Dre. And lastly, I earned my DJ name in the Army, unfortunately. So free fall is what I got.
So I have a DJ name, not like I'm any good, but it is sort of like that. So, no, I'm going to tackle the human question too, because I agree to a great extent. Humans, us, need to come up with new ways to, I don't want to say employ ourselves, but yeah, find money or to spend our time, be creative. There's a big problem. There's a lot of people who cannot afford to write poetry. There are people who just simply cannot make rent, so they don't have time to think about these things. They have time to think about how to beat traffic to get to their next home. But I think that we, as a culture, especially with something so inspiring as rockets and fire, and with a variety of communication mediums, such as GoPros and music and whatnot. The fact is that if we pay attention, honor, respect individual creativity, whatever it may be, whether it serves the corporate mission or the cultural mission, if we respect that, allow time, enable people to be creative in different ways, that will infect how people do work and also spread out to the greater culture when everybody goes home.
So I'm going to, my DJ name would be Court Jester, spelled Jesther, which is my name.
Perfect.
So the thing I want to call out, and it's not an answer to a specific question, but from what I heard here, Rafferty is right. forget the diversity of color and gender and even nationality. The number of people in this room who are engineers, the people in your company are not all going to be engineers. And whether you're trying to attract employees or trying to persuade government officials that you're an interesting company to have in their jurisdiction, you should be attractive to lots of different kinds of people. And the HR people, the accountants, the logistics people, you don't need to study math to do all of these. You need to study math in order to tell whether a politician is lying and to do your taxes. But not every job that's interested in the US or in the world is in engineers. So it's really that diversity that you need to embrace, that your company is a team of different kinds of people doing different kinds of jobs. And that is what it's going to take to turn your idea into something that is sustainable.
So to court jester, motorbike Matt, free fall, riff-raff, and crash, thank you so much.
What's yours?
I think I'd like to go by General Disarray. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
All right.
It's not just investors, not just enthusiasts. We have a couple of board members who are pretty confrontational, and that actually helps a lot when trying to look at different ideas and making sure you don't just have a lot of yes votes, although I always make sure I have a majority of yes votes. But it is good to have that breadth of board involvement and looking at which constituencies you want to engage in, whether you want to impress them with the resumes of your board members because they're an affiliated company, or whether you need an entree. That's something to look at which pieces of the mosaic they fill in your company strategy.
Do you want? So I've sat on many boards. I've negotiated whatever. There's a couple of things to think about, and diversity among board members is really important. They change over time. When a company is starting, board members do everything from help you write press releases to work in marketing, give contacts. They're very involved in the operation of the company. Right to the other end where they mostly deal with compliance and shareholder relations, and candidly it's not half as much fun. It's really important for the board not to be just the founder's best friends, because the board needs to represent the shareholders, has fiduciary duty to represent the best interests of the company, not of themselves, not even of the investors, but the company itself. A final thing worth thinking about, I've been on boards of companies that have gotten into trouble. And you can argue all day long about who has how many votes, or, like Mark Zuckerberg, he's got all the votes. But the entity that really has the power in the end is the entity that's going to give the company the next chunk of money if it's in trouble. Because that entity is the one who can decide everything. And sometimes you see things go really badly south and lots of people get diluted and so forth. But it's really important to understand, once you as an entrepreneur bring in investors, you lose power to those investors if you're not making enough money to sustain yourself without them. And the board likewise has no power if the company's not self-sustaining. I'm sorry to be so gloomy, but it's kind of, you need to think about reality, not just what the law books say.
Yeah, please, Don.
Does this thing work?
I think so.
Oh, wow. Okay, so to concur, partially what you're saying is that as an architect, I get to boil things down and hopefully sell simplicity. But the notion is...
Right. Well, thank you, Rob, for revealing one of the great mysteries of the NewSpace industry. I feel many of us here at the moment have Facebook news feeds that are currently cluttered with different stories from the NewSpace industry. Over the years, the description of the industry has been summed up by single descriptive words. So let me give you an example. About 10 years ago, you would read an article about the private space industry, which was part of a new industry. New was the descriptive word. Around 5-ish years ago, there was an invisible transition to describing the industry as developing. What is it being called now? I think it's called burgeoning. If you go read an article, burgeoning is the word. Here to lead us in discussion about non-NewSpace country industries that have already burgeoned and are now established is Kelly Girardi. I first met Kelly when she was working for Maston Space Systems, where she was the lead of business development. She's worked as a strategist across a broad spectrum of aerospace companies, government agencies, and nonprofits. She's a media specialist of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, the U.S. trade association of leading commercial spaceflight companies. She is one cool person, and there is very little other people who I'd like to lead this panel discussion. So thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. I'd love to welcome my panelists up now. And we only have an hour for this panel, and there's so many different directions we could go with it. So I'm going to, and I hope that you guys will understand, but I'm going to do very brief introductions for you so that we can use most of the time contextualizing your experience and kind of passing on that insight to the rest of the industry. So very briefly, I will start with Stockton Rush. He's the CEO and co-founder of OceanGate, developing the next gen of manned submersible solutions for subsea operations in research, commercial, and defense sectors. He has piloted me on one of those expeditions, so I can say he is a top-notch sub-pilot, and Erica as well, and I think Esther as well. So yeah, highly rated. We also have Rafferty Jackson, who's a veteran brand and business builder. He's led startups and Fortune 500 companies alike through hyper-growth, IPOs, expansions. She's worked with everything from Beats by Dr. Dre to Vans and the North Face, serving in a variety of roles from legal counsel to vice president to business development to HR. Then we have Don Brancato, the chief enterprise architect of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. His job entails working with the enterprise.
Beef with this room. So I live right now down in Santa Monica, which I moved from San Francisco down to Santa Monica to join Beats by Dr. Dre, which is a headphone company. I'm sure you guys hopefully have heard of it. We built a $6 billion market out of nothing, and we sold ourselves to Apple for $3 billion. Did it all in 6 years. We had a lot of reasons why we were able to do that. First of all, we had a visionary at the helm. Jimmy Iovine. He's created more music than I can even spend time talking to you about. He's basically been touching culture, building culture. And then a guy named Dr. Dre, who, if you don't know The Chronic, you need to listen to The Chronic, even if you don't agree with it, because it changed music. So it's probably similar to you guys stand amongst yourselves and say, oh, did you read that article by so-and-so? It changed space. There's things in culture that have changed culture, and The Chronic is one of those things. Jimmy Iovine doing Patti Smith's Horses, that changed culture. Doing Tom Petty's Refugee album, that changed culture. So I'm working with people who changed culture and drive culture. I live where we can see SpaceX launches and contrails and all sorts of exciting things. Nobody knows anything about it. I can look up in the sky and see the contrail going. I can ask my neighbor walking by my stoop, do you know what that is? No, I don't know what that is. There is storytelling to be told. And storytelling is what compels human beings to connect to other human beings. And we all know this. We've seen the cave drawings. We have seen how people tell stories, and we know how we connect with them. We sit with our children every day, read them a bedtime story, right? When you're trying to explain to somebody their job, you're basically telling them a story. One of the challenges I had when Guillermo asked me to come speak here was like, what am I going to talk to you guys about? I feel like you have the most amazing stories. You just saw that rocket landing. It's the first time music played in this room. I had said to somebody at lunch today, this is the most quiet conference I've ever had. There's a reason why Beats by Dr. Dre pulled on the heartstrings of people who had never, ever expected to drop $399 for a pair of headphones, because it connected you to the emotion of your music. It put you in a space that made you, whatever music you were listening to, feel powerful, emotional, connected to humanity, and wanting to go. This last video, when it finally had music, I was like, oh, thank God, somebody is, And if you guys noticed, I wish we could have had a camera on you. When the music played, you all sat up to see what was happening, because that pulls at you. So
that boards have a phase, if you will. The first one is one of entrepreneurship, followed by growth, followed by maintenance. They are typically separate boards, and that's why there's a life cycle around them. So their role is one of governance to assure that an enterprise architecture exists so that the global events and drivers that the business is taking advantage of with strategy are in fact planned for and expected. So I use the word enterprise architecture as a template for the future. The overarching viewpoint or capability that I expect the board to have is one of governance to assure that the variance between what's been forecast and what's actually happened it can be minimized and measured such that we can move forward in a measurable way.
Yeah, and I also think just to add and build off of that oftentimes in young companies that are, positioning themselves for growth, that there's a lot of room for meritocracy to take place. You don't need to necessarily depend on board of advisors for all of the strategic decision making. Something that I've implemented at a number of organizations that I've worked with is something I stole from a favorite company of mine, Pixar, which is called a brain trust. And basically it's a group of hand-selected people. It can be anyone from a janitor to an intern, anyone who makes you think smarter and can rapidly give you ideas in a short period of time. Those are the people you want kind of in your ear and just throwing spaghetti on the wall and going back and forth. And, many, many times in a company even that size, they're responsible for, when suddenly there was once a forest and now there are only trees, someone who can come in and kind of give you the advice that you need and be a fresh set of eyes. So I think that there's a lot of room in this industry to rely on, advisors and, people outside of the board of directors. But moving off of that, I also am interested in the fact that we've grown so much. A few years ago, we were talking at this stage in Silicon Valley at this conference about the NewSpace echo chamber and the fact that all of us are just consistently telling each other what a great job we're doing. It's so awesome, patting each other on the back, and it's just in this one big echo chamber. And this was the scope. This is where the conversation was ending. We've definitely moved beyond that, largely in part thanks to companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX and Mastodon and all the people who are sending out videos and footage and propelling us forward. But speaking of branding and consumer engagement, especially with your experience, Rafferty, as well, curious, what can even companies who aren't selling directly to consumer or targeting a tourism bureau, but who are concerned with brand and building that brand for heritage and posterity down the road, what lessons can we learn from other industries?
Yeah, on this point, I have a personal
leaders to discuss, validate, and ensure strategic and tactical initiatives and pain points, and to find a viable, competitive, best practice architecture for a solution. And then we have Matthew Reyes, who's the strategic content manager for GoPro's advanced media team, from VR to 360-degree capture. And then we have Esther Dyson, of course, the chairman of ED Venture Holdings, investing in nurturing startups with recent focus in healthcare, human capital, and aerospace sectors. So we have a lot of people from a variety of different industries, but the one cool thing is that on this stage, everyone has a little bit of space in their blood. Esther spent a year in Star City training as a backup. Half a year in Star City training as a backup cosmonaut. Matt, prior to GoPro, was the head of technical operations for Zero G Corporation. Many of you probably flew in Zero G with him and was a NASA subcontractor. Stockton commercial pilot, aerospace engineer. Don, before working at Hewlett-Packard, was a former aerospace engineer, and Rafferty has got space in her future. So,
actually, my dad was an engineer on the unmanned rockets out of Cape Canaveral.
I knew it. So in addition to coming from like a variety of different industries, we also have people who are kindred spirits up here on the stage, and so I think that makes their insights particularly valuable. So, one of the things that I took away and where I'd love to start this morning is kind of building off of something that Chuck Beams said earlier when discussing Vulcan, saying that as an industry, we've reached a great point of growth, but we're very likely to start seeing a little bit more scrutiny from investors with regard to business plans. They want to see return on investment. They want to see a sound business plan. And one of the ways that we, look in the new space industry towards investment is kind of relying on a board, relying on advisors. And so I wanted to know from your experience in the industries that you work with, to what extent do you rely on the board and advisors? And what roles do they play in strategic investment, And how can we, as an industry, kind of learn from your insights? And Stockton, maybe we'll start with you because I know you have a lot of experience with
Thank you. I hope it works. Yeah. Well, the board, in one level, is, and our board in particular, we rely on, one of the board members is a retired admiral from the Coast Guard. So we have regulatory issues, and we have a couple of folks represent the investors. When you're in the financing round, obviously there's a mix that you might have of your board and then the operational support, and we've tried to blend those. I think it is critical that you have them from a variety of backgrounds.